Jacob, could you talk a little bit more about the process of doing the fellowship? Because this our focus really is on experiential learning in general. Internships are the keystone, but the doing independent research and presenting your work at conferences and those kinds of things, study abroad, are also very important parts of our aspirations for our students. And one of the things that interests me is how beautifully your research dovetails with what you're doing with Y2Y. Could you talk about developing the idea with Cindy Stretch and so forth?
Of course. Thank you for the question, Dr. Beira. So my fellowship was entitled Documenting New Haven's Homeless in Their Own Voice. The idea was I came to it with the idea of wanting to write something about a more underrepresented community. As an English major, you will hear everything about people like Shakespeare, John Milton, all the famous guys. But for me, at least, it got to a point where I wanted to know about stories from people who aren't usually listened to. So Dr. Stretch and I developed the idea over last spring, in the middle of the whole COVID explosion. I actually have a visual demonstration. So most of what I did was I read stories from the Elm City Echo. This is a literary magazine published by the Yale Hunger and Homelessness Project. It's a street periodical. They aren't doing it like this anymore, but it used to be if you went downtown to the New Haven Green, you would see people, the authors themselves, selling issues for $1 or $2 or whatever they think is fair. It is poetry, stories, autobiography, all from people who were experiencing homelessness in the city, in New Haven, as they were writing it. In addition to that, I also read stories from a one-time publication by Thomas House back in 2000. The idea was to explore these narratives in kind of a traditional literary analysis. I wanted to know what the big themes were, what the big emotions were about being homeless. Sorry about that, everybody. Can you hear me a little bit better now?
Yeah, I was saying the
Okay.
sound was breaking up, and so
So the
Jacob's turned off
project
the video
went
now.
through a number of different versions. At one point, it was going to be a bigger study of homelessness in American literature. But over time, Dr. Stretch and I got the idea that it would be better to focus it on stories purely written by individuals that were experiencing homelessness. Good. Sorry about that, everybody. But yeah, eventually it became more of a narrative study. The final product, the final paper was arguing that personal identity is a product of personal narrative, and personal narrative is always connected to the space that you live in. I connected stories that had been written by homeless individuals to a book written by a French anthropologist named Marc Augé called Non-Places. He was arguing that we inhabit either an anthropological place where you can identify with the space that you're in, your house, your hometown, your university, that sort of thing, versus non-places where we spend much of our lives, but we don't have any kind of personal connection to. More so, those spaces forbid personal connection by virtue of their function. A homeless shelter is a good example of this. You are allowed to be there for a little while, but you aren't expected to identify with the shelter. To answer Dr. Bayrock's question, my research is trying to get rid of that as much as possible. There is a limit to the amount that you can identify from the shelter, but we don't want them to feel like liminal spaces. We don't want them to feel like non-spaces. I read several narratives from the Elm City Echo where authors discuss their religious faith and how they use biblical narratives to give themselves a sense of place at home despite not having a permanent physical residence. So in the end, I came to the conclusion that in the absence of a physical place, a narrative space can kind of take that place and fill the gap.